So I will also speak as loudly as I can. So I'm no longer a laureate fellow, actually, as of October last year. I'm just a regular dude, which means I'm teaching, which means I'm now looking at you going, I presume it's the naughty kids up the back and the good kids down the front. And I guess a year ago, I think I might have done the same thing at the beginning of the TESS seminar. Opened it up. I can't remember what I talked about, but here I am again. And I'm sort of talking about what's really a sideline from my main research interest, but it's been going for quite a few years now, and I find it quite interesting, which is how do people get here, and today, how do they get through this large continent? So it's going to be a little bit of a revisit of what's now published, and then some quite cool work, I think, that's sort of coming out. In fact, I wasn't supposed to speak about it till May, so speaking about it now is a little bit premature, and it's not actually in my brain, so don't ask any hard questions. So this actually came out of our Centre of Excellence. We had a masterclass in Santa Fe last year, which is excellent. Got to see some snow, don't see that very often. So these are the people who are most recently involved in this piece of work. I won't name them all. They're from the Santa Fe Institute, Sandia National Labs, that's Devon. His job is something with the government. He says he's going to have to kill me if he tells me what that is. But he's actually an anthropologist, and so this is sort of a sideline for him as well. Sean Ulm, who you know from here. And two people weren't present, so I've stuck him up on the wall there. That's Rob Beeman. I don't know if he's in here today. He's probably on a ship somewhere, and Alan Williams, an archaeologist. So I am presenting, in a sense, on their behalf. And in terms of expertise, the group's about half modelers and about half data people, which is kind of cool. It's kind of hard to talk to people about maths, but I do my best. So the talk will just be Sunda-Wallacea, Sahul. So the first bit is getting into Sahul. That is the joined continent of Australia and Papua New Guinea at times of lowered sea level when people were arriving. And that's demographic and drift modelling. And then the new bit is what happened then. How do people get through Australia? So just some background. So there is Sunderland, and at times of lowered sea level, it was not too bad. There was a series of very nice lakes. There was some tropical rainforest, but probably contracted back to east and west of the equator with a savanna corridor right down the middle. And Homo sapiens are savanna-adapted creatures originally. And so potentially an opportunity to come straight down the middle of that into Wallacea, or you could go around the coast. A new work just published, Chris Worster in our group has again shown that that savanna corridor does most likely exist. So now in southern Borneo, we have evidence of savannas where there is now forest during the last glacial period. That's not what I'm talking about today. So there's been an interest in how people got through to Australia, ultimately from Africa, but how they got through the last bit for a very long time. It's been a debate that's been going on forever and ever, because you can see what you've got to do is you've got to swim, or you've got to float, you've got to do something, fly to do some of it, because there's no land bridges. And the distances are quite dramatic. So that's in kilometres, and there's always a 100-kilometre stretch of water you've got to get across, more or less, whichever way you go. And 50,000 years ago, well, we don't really know whether that was how easy that was. What were the capabilities of the people at that time? Could they do it? And there's all sorts of assumptions you've got to make about what sea level was and what uplift rates are doing, all that sort of stuff. And whether you can actually see where you're going is the other thing. So a lot of the early work said, can you see the next place you're going to? And some routes you can, some routes you can't, but it depends on the assumptions you make. And most previous assumptions have been people wandered up to the tallest hill and go, yeah, I can see that. But I don't think that's actually a good way of doing it. I think you've got to see what you can see from the beach, essentially. And so there's been two routes proposed, southern route into the sort of Kimberley area, and basically a northern route into the Bird's Head, New Guinea. And so all this previous work, including my own previous work, did not really consider what you could see actually from the beach. So the work we did and have now published says, what can you see from the beach? And it also didn't really consider the demographics. It's not just one person or two people. You've got to have a viable population, like with any organism. You've got to get a certain number of individuals to the next spot before they can create a viable population. So we did this all again, and this is work that's now published and was heavily relied on Moita Ziegler up the back there and Damien O'Grady, who's now in Melbourne. Looking at what you could see from the coast and 1 pixel back from the coast. So basically, if it's a steep coast, you get a little bit higher. And so where you see the 4s there, it means all the routes are visible. Where you see a 0, it means the destination is not visible. So by that definition, you can't see anything on the southern route, and it's all visible across the northern route. So that suggests, well, maybe the northern route. Because if you're an early human, you've then got to conceptualise that there's land there that you can't see. Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. So then can you get there, right? So this is hard to explain. I just thought I'd show you a screen grab of this. So this is the drift modelling software we used. It's a CSIRO product. It's publicly available. You can model whatever you want using this. And you put in times and dates for real currents and real airflows over the last 20 years. And you say you can allow people to paddle, or you can allow them to drift, or do whatever you want. Set a time and see where they get to at the end of that time. So you do that for all of these sites. Here's one, for example, and we had different levels of skill. So one is you fall in, where do you end up? Which means you can fall in at any time of year. The second one is you go, I think the winds are going to be better this season. So you pick a season and say you can go in the season. And the third one is, I'm really smart. I know how this is going to work. I'm picking the best time to go. Right? So you have sort of a layered chance of success. So this is one for down here, coming to the Kimberley. That is the random. You have a very small chance of arriving if you just fall off in 4 days. This is the best week of all years, and this is optimal. The best weeks are the best years, and you're paddling, right? So you don't get there if you're just floating. If you're paddling, you've got a very good chance of getting across. And it's only a little bit of paddling. It's not, not motorboat style. It's 0.25 metres a second. So half a knot. And then you do that for 17 other sites, and they're not all shown because they overlap, but you can see for the southern route, the blues are I just fell in randomly, and the other ones are optimal. And you can see there that different routes have different probabilities of getting there in the 4 days. Some of them look more likely, some of them look less likely. And the same thing on the northern route. Some of them look highly likely, and in fact, most of them look highly likely for most of those, if you assume a level of skill. That is, you can paddle and you can think about it. And of course, it depends on how fast you can paddle. So for that site up here, which is a pretty prospective route, then we looked at what happens if you paddle faster. So that's no paddling, 4 days. You've still got an 82% chance of getting there by that route, but you've got to have done all the other island hops to get there. If you just assume a very minimal paddling, you can get there in 3 days, 95%. Speed it up to what we used for the average, which is the half a knot. You can get there in 2 days, 91% of you will. And if you can really hoof it, you can get there in a day and a half. And I guess if you had a motorboat, you could get there in a half a day, etc. And of course, we don't know where people were on that spectrum of skill. So that's the first thing. But then this is where the modelling comes in, and or more modelling comes in. You've got to think about what is the size of a viable population. And this is now published. I'm not going to go into it in great detail because I'd like to get onto the new stuff. But you need to know about numbers of people, how often they're falling off into the ocean, once they get there, how long are they living, how many babies are they making, and all that sort of thing. And then there's things like a disease that suddenly comes through and might randomly wipe them out once every number of years. And ultimately, that shows that you really can't do it randomly. So unless you have more than 40 people washed off together every year, every 20 years, you can't establish a viable population on the other side. Right, or at least it's a less than 5% chance. And the northern route is slightly more viable than the southern in that context. So you've got to get there, you've got to establish a population, you've got to find the next island, you've got to get to that, and so forth. So the net result of all of that is that you need about 1,300 to 1,500 people to have arrived on Sahul in order to establish a viable population without all the inbreeding effects and so on and so forth that accompany small populations. This could have been multiple voyages of 130 people over about 700 years. So we don't really know what it was, but it was a lot of people, and in the red there, a lot of people came, they knew what they were doing, they knew how to do it, and they knew where they were going. So they arrived in Sahul. So what then? And this is these are the various models, sort of, that have been proposed for what happened when people arrived. So you've got your coastal route there, you've got a woodland route, and you've got that rapid route down the bottom. You've got the Australia Day route here, which suggests people might have arrived from New Zealand. And if you sort of formalise that, or at least look at what people have said in the literature over the last several decades, those are the models that you find. Sort of coastal, everywhere, woodland, various other options. But you see the arrows, they're all these big sweeping arrows and what have you. There's no detail. So where we started was looking at the importance of water, the importance of water sources. So you find all the water, and then you look at how connected those water sources are. Now, I'm not going to go into this again, it's published, but it turns out that 86% of the greater than 30,000-year-old sites are within 20 k's of water. All right, so that provides a little bit of validation that water is key. And then you draw your big arrows all over it and you go, well, they might have been here, they might have gone down there. It looks like they went down through that relatively well-watered sort of savanna area in inland Queensland. And then in the same year, from looking at the genetic diversity of Indigenous hair samples, and completely independently, another map was drawn, which looks, again, it's got the big arm-waving arrows and stuff, but it looks kind of like ours. And you go, oh, maybe there's something in there. But it's still unsatisfying. It doesn't say where people went. So the genes and the water are sort of suggesting this coastal but also inland thing. So here is the new work from now. Oh, I'm not doing too bad. So, and this is where I will struggle because this is pretty serious modelling. So this is the guy that will kill me if he ever tells me what he really does. And I'm poorly equipped to deal with it. But in a nutshell, it puts a grid over a landscape and then looks how easy it is to get from any point to any other point across that grid. So it has a topography and it has realistic estimates of calorific use, assuming that people are X age and can walk Y kilometres in a day and all that sort of thing. And it's basically a pathfinding algorithm, which the GIS people will understand, but it's a very computationally efficient pathfinding algorithm, which allows you to deal with very, very large problems. So it's called from everywhere to everywhere, which is literally what it's trying to do. It's trying to find what's the easiest way to get from everywhere to everywhere. In this case, from water to water. And you get a very large computer, and you do it a lot of times with various weightings for various things you might think are important, river courses. It turns out that visibility of landscape features is important. And you look at all the paths and then you see which ones were the ones that were most used. And you don't worry about the rest and you have a look at the important ones. So just to give you an example, you have a network of points and there would be a lot more points there. You come up with a set of connected paths between those points based on calorific efficiency and various other things. And then you threshold it to find which are more used. So the red ones there are more used. And so this is an example, I don't know how well it'll show. If you just look for the red line, so this is Oaxaca in Mexico, so one province, and that's where the FEAT model says the routes are. And the little dots there are all the Aztec. Okay, Aztec, I'm not an archaeologist. All the Aztec edifices. And they're on the junctions of these routes or along these routes on little local topographic highs. And you go, that's not bad. And then you look at the routes the Spanish identified as having been used by the Aztecs, and it overlays remarkably accurately. And you go, well, okay, that seems to be reasonably valid. So that's the sort of thing it does. And he's also used it to find the best ways into cities after the Haitian earthquake, used it to figure out where people were migrating during some of the Ebola viruses, the Ebola scares, and most recently, I think, Syrian refugees. Where would they be filtering through borders and things like that? This is why he has to kill me if he tells me what he really does, I suspect. Okay, so that's an example, and I looked at that and go, wow, that's really kind of cool. The computer doesn't know where the Aztec sites are or what the Spanish maps were saying, and yet they seem to concur. Right, so we have a slightly bigger area than one state of a relatively small country. We have a whole continent. And this is why you need something like this computationally efficient way of doing it. And you also need some other stuff, which is where us poor data munchkins come in. So you need topography and bathymetry. So for this project, we've made a homogeneous 250-metre grid for the entire continent out to the shelf plate, including New Guinea, by combining the bathymetry with the topography. And basically, Rod Beeman did that. And then you also need to run the rivers out to the shelf edge, because they stop at the edge of Australia at the moment. That's not very useful. So you need to do that, and that needs to be homogeneous. And then what we were wondering was, you know, you're in the middle of Australia, what are you going to be looking at? You see Ayers Rock, you're probably going to go there, right? So you're looking for things that will guide you through the landscape. It's not just, you're not just going to walk off into the wilderness. You're going to be sort of attracted to things you can see because they might have water or whatever. That's the assumption. So that is not a map of topography, that's a map of visibility. So that's the visibility of every point. Brighter is more visible from every other point within the range of visibility. So you can kind of see it is sort of topographic. You can see New Guinea shows up pretty well, various bits of the Pilbara and what have you, but it's not a topographic map. It's a derivation of a topographic map. And then you can't have people walking on water, so you've got to mask out all the megalakes that were around at that time. The two main ones are the Gulf of Carpentaria, or Lake Carpentaria, and Lake Bass. The other ones are relatively small in the grand scheme of things. And so then you've got your sort of conceptual model and you can start to make paths, but how do you validate it? So we thought the best way of doing this was, again, use the old archaeology. So all the red dots there are older than 35. The whole thing was redone by Sean. I think we ended up with a cutoff of 35,000 years, so everything older than 35,000, all sort of quality checked and added to from the time we were doing this original work, because things like Majabibi didn't exist. And then you can have a look. Right, so you run combinations of all these variables you think might be important. And using the archaeology, you see whether the model output has explanatory value. If it does have explanatory value, sort of goes into the big pot, and at the end, all of those which have explanatory value are weighted by the amount of explanatory value they have, mashed together to produce a final map. There you go. There's a non-mathematician talking about pretty complicated maths. And you can see some of the routes on there. That's up in the, you can see the Bonaparte Gulf there, sort of Kimberley region. And then 125 billion paths later, that's the map. And you can see the black dots there is the old archaeology. Right? And I think that is super cool, because all the old archaeology actually aligns with the reddish or yellowish paths, except in a couple of places which I'll come to in a second. Right, so you can see there's this big diagonal. I'll come back to that big diagonal thing that goes from Kimberley to South Australia. There's things through northern New South Wales, there's things through the Pilbara, Kimberley across into New Guinea. So there's a lot to interrogate there. I'm not necessarily going to do it today. If you have a look up there, that's a close-up of the path maps, and this is not full resolution. That's why it looks a little bit grainy. These are still being prepared. I just have to give this talk earlier than I was thinking. And you can see how it aligns with the archaeology. If you look down here, you can see it aligns with the archaeology mostly, except for that bit there. And that's the Lake Mungo kind of area, and there's a very good reason it doesn't align there. Mungo lakes were full of water back then. They're not now, so there's no water there to go to in this model. So it's not surprising. And I think this is really cool too. So just a couple of weeks ago, this paper was published that was dating, actually down near one of our little red paths there, but dating volcanoes, and local indigenous stories have memories of those volcanic eruptions, or at least have stories of those volcanic eruptions, quite detailed. And those eruptions were 37,000 years ago. So that is an oral history potentially going back 37,000 years. And I guess for today, it's also close to one of our red lines. So how else do you test this? Right, so you can look at trade routes, and here's another one of these great, got a map of Australia with a bunch of arrows going on, etc. But you can see the main elements are there. So you can see the diagonal from Kimberley to South Australia. That's known because of pearl trade from Kimberley to South Australia. Right, it's a well-known route. You can sort of see the Burke and Wills route up the middle there. So sort of up here. I'll come back to why that's yellow in a minute, rather than bright red. So greenstone axis from Victoria went all the way up through here. Pitcheree from in around Birdsville went all the way around here. That was a sort of a stimulant drink or substance. So there is an alignment with what modern trade routes would also tell you was the case. You can also have a look at the language map. So this is the spread of the Parma-Yungan languages 7,000 years ago. I can see some correspondence. I don't know whether it means anything or not. I don't know how good their map is. I don't actually know how good my map is. But there is an element there that can probably be teased out, and I'll get to how in a minute. You can look at the early explorers map. So that's a georeferenced old map. So that's why it's a bit skew with. But you can see the Burke and Wills route straight up the middle here. Todd, for example, knew he was going to Darwin, but some of the earlier guys are sort of tracing out, a lot of them trace this thing and then head out over this way. So, I don't know. And the reason I'm not going to really put too much weight on any of that at this juncture is because Sahul is not Australia. So this is a weighted average map of a continent that includes massive areas that are no longer there. So what now needs to happen is to do it for Australia, which should be a much easier job. So do it for the Holocene. We have a lot more data. We have a lot more stuff we know about. Things like the languages, they will date to the Holocene, more or less. The trade routes, maybe they do go back 50,000 years, but they certainly go back thousands of years. Stock routes as well. Stock routes probably followed original trade routes. So there's a lot of other ways we can test it. Now, if you take out, for example, if you turn this back into Australia, Lake Carpentaria goes and none of this matters. So you'll get a different alignment of most of this stuff here, for example. And you'll lose a lot of these other coastal routes. So in fact, other routes that are still there will become more prominent. And they will in fact change because the geography has changed. So that's not why I'm not saying, I'm not putting too much faith in anything in detail about some of the more modern comparators we could use. We have to do this again for essentially modern, or at least a couple of thousand-year-old Australia, which is the plan. And within, so this is the roots at the scale of the continent. So within whatever, Western Queensland, there will be a different set of routes, or a different set of routes will have priority because Western Queensland doesn't know about the rest of Australia. So for each large region, there will be a series of other maps, which probably will look like this, but not necessarily, that will throw into greater prominence routes that aren't as prominent at the continental scale. Okay, so that didn't take too long. There's a bunch of slides I chucked out, I shouldn't have. So the conclusions are quite simple, really. Lots of people came, they knew what they were doing. They came 50,000 years ago. They had the capacity to make a 100-kilometre open ocean voyage. That tells me that they're kind of like me, except they didn't have an iPhone. They had the same intellectual capacity. They were anatomically modern humans. They just didn't have an iPhone. They had bits of stone and they could still make a raft. They could still observe what was going on. They could still have a very good understanding of it. They could still plan. They could talk to each other in large groups and coordinate a voyage of 100 kilometres to Australia. And then when they got here, it seems like there's an underlying sort of geography to the whole place, which potentially does direct early exploration. Even if you don't know where you're going, oh, well, I can see that mountain, I'm going to go there. I need water, so I can't go there because there's no water there. So there is an underlying sort of cognitive geography that people were using in order to navigate some of these novel environments that they were encountering. Right, so people went straight into the desert. So it didn't really matter what environment it was. Bang, they figured out a way of dealing with it. And I guess so we need to do the reanalysis to get the modern maps for the Holocene. And then we need to do a proper job of comparing, not just me spouting off, about how these things might relate to trade routes, song lines, stock routes, exploration routes, movement of language and so forth. And I do wonder, and this is relevant, I think, to the biodiversity people in the room, certainly in the early wave of colonisation, I think megafauna, for example, in some places was probably considerably more at risk in other places. If people weren't just wandering randomly, they were using paths or using relatively defined trackways. So that has implications for megafaunal extinction. And I do wonder whether these routes, if we call them that, these superhighways, whether there is something else biodiversity associated with it. Let's say people are moving along these routes with their plant X, seeds of plant X. Is that a dispersal pathway for those plants or for any other things? Is it actually something animals might use as well? And I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think there's probably a lot of questions that will now be answered. And I don't think I can spin it out any longer than that. Thank you. I think there'll be a microphone. asking questions so people in Townsville can hear.
Michael, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, so these guys are really good at artwork. One of their caves with lots of pictures of boats in there.
Yeah, is that a Kingswood?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay. They're all relatively young, so that relates to Holocene. So it's not this deep time stuff.
Right.
So doesn't relate to the initial population stuff. But in terms of art, there are art associations, and again, I'm not qualified to talk, that sort of go from south of the Pilbara into the Western Desert on what appear to be some of these routes. So people like Joe McDonald at UWA have spent a lot of time trying to put together associations of artwork. And one of the things we will also be trying to do is correlate those art styles, whatever, with these routes and see if there's anything there.
Thank you.
I've got another question from Townsville in relation to the routes and savanna and fire. Firstly, I'm wondering about the assumption of line of sight. If it was savanna, I assume it was burning, and people have known where country was just from fire, rather than having to be on beach and see it. And secondly, whether there's any indication of fire associated with those routes as well, or historical burning along them.
Well, certainly one of the things you'd think, you don't necessarily need to be able to see land. So going back to Wallacea and getting to Sahul, you can see smoke from fires, you can see clouds that are associated with land masses. And if you're smart, you can associate those with land. And that's one of the reasons why people might have come here. In terms of fire while in Australia, the earliest people that were doing this had no people in front of them, by definition, if you like. So they were walking into a landscape that didn't have people burning down the track, etc., because they were the first people to be there. So right at the start, I'm sure they were using fire, but I don't think they were finding themselves by fire. And then I guess fire is such a part of the landscape anyway in most of Australia that teasing apart an anthropogenic signal from that fire record is actually quite tricky, particularly back this far because there's not that many records.
Thanks, Michael. So what's to say that the earliest people weren't always seafarers or for a long period seafarers, and they just kept moving down by boat?
Yeah. I wasn't there at the time. So there is another option, which is that everybody whizzed around the coast. Maybe that happened as well. But at some point, and by the 35,000 year mark, they weren't using boats because the rivers don't have water in them most of the year. So at some point they had to get out, and then they're on that map somewhere. Take yours first, that's right. Microphone's closer.
With regard to the fire issue, lightning and storms like that would definitely create fire. And if it happens to be at the right time when people are heading probably around that southern route, they may well see the smoke from a long distance away, because some of those fires are pretty amazing. Yeah, can get up to 12,000 feet. So I think one question would be, rather than people already having been here to light fires, is the fact that storms would create them, and then they would therefore be visible to people on an island in southern Indonesia, for example.
Yeah, that is certainly the case. And I mean, fire is such an important element for humans here as everywhere, basically. I mean, you can think about it in a tall grass savanna, for example. If a fire goes through, it's a lot easier to walk through. The question nobody's asked me yet is, did you wait for different environments? Like, is it harder to get through a forest versus a desert? And the answer is we haven't. But I suspect that savannas, for example, would be very easy to traverse, particularly if you're just burning down the grass, basically. So I think fire and humans go together. They always have. There was one up with Saraf. Don't ask me a maths question. Oh, you have to wait for the microphone. Or? Oh, they still won't hear you, I don't think.
I was just going to ask, would you know the mechanism the software uses to derive the probabilities? Or is it just an artifact of the geometry of Sahul, or what is data based on which it derives these probabilities?
So the data layers are a series of parameters for how humans use energy. And then these topographic things, visibility, so spatial layers, which include the topography, bathymetry, the distribution of water points, the visibility of the topography, which is different from the topography itself, the network of river channels. And I think those are all the things that were sort of thrown into the mix.
Michael, thanks for that. I'm going to use one of your favourite phrases. I'm not qualified to speak about this, but I was attracted by your idea of the biodiversity link. I just finished reading a book called On Track, which is about the Bundian Way, which extends from Kosciuszko to about Twofold Bay. It was used for a very long time, although how long is not clear from this. But one of the things that the guy who wrote it talks about is the preferential location of edible tuberous plants along this track. Various other changes to the vegetation, which that's one. And I remember years ago, Peter Latz out of Alice Springs spoke about relocation of edible plants, usable plants by Indigenous people in the centre. I think you've got something there, but I mean, you might Latz's work and other people. He covered a huge area in the centre. Yeah. I don't know whether he's still with us, but he's very bad at writing as well. So who knows if it's been preserved.
There's quite a few things of that ilk. There's a Bunya trail that runs through Queensland somewhere, and short answer is I'm not qualified to talk about that because there's a whole PhD probably in every state looking in detail at how these things might match up. And some way they might, some way they mightn't. But I think transport of edible plants is probably potentially really important. And I guess I'm really interested in that sort of the Kimberley South Australia route because it is so prominent regardless what you do, and it's known from trade routes, but there's very little archaeology. And of course that's because there's nowhere to preserve the archaeology. So there's plenty of archaeology out there, but it's on the surface. So there's no chronological context to say that's an old site. So it might be that there is some distribution of some edible plant that is related to that track or something, I don't know. But I mean, there is a huge number of ways you can take this, I think. None of which I'm qualified to do.
Yes, I was going to follow on from that discussion on fire. A lot of that country in the northern part of Australia and previously on what is now the Sahul Shelf were iron-rich sandstones, and lightning was very common in those areas and still is. Anybody who's lived in the Kimberleys would know the enormous lightning storms you get up there. And the Sahul Shelf at that point was also covered in grassland, as you've also mentioned. There's the paper about 20 or 30 years ago by Dortch and Muir that suggested that bushfire smoke could be used as an incentive for people to travel across. And it could be as easily seen from Sahul, we know that. Yeah. So there was a clear incentive. You didn't know what was there, but you knew land was there, obviously.
And what that says to me, I think the Dortch paper was the first people to propose that. It might have been proposed earlier. But It seems very sensible once it's said, but it is quite important to say. If only because it means that you have the ability, without your iPhone, to make that link between what you can't see, or you can see some smoke. You've got to think as a human 50,000 years ago, smoke, fire, fire, land, must be land, I can't see it. It's kind of weird, but I'm going to go there anyway. So it says quite a bit about the cognitive abilities if that southern route was the route that was chosen or that was taken. It might have been the northern route where fire is not such an issue because it's all forested. Is that it?
Michael, you were going to say why that is yellow and not red.
Why is it yellow, not red?
Yeah, I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that the Gulf of Carpentaria is not the Gulf of Carpentaria. So a lot of the tracks, when you have an exposed shelf up there, they're all pulled around the northern part of Lake Carpentaria. I think once you can sort of see the Gulf is there, like that's the coastline of Australia there. So Burke and Wills and whatever else, it goes up to there, and then it kind of peters out here because with this geography, the model thinks that's the best option. So in the Holocene, when we redo it again, I think you will see much more going on down in here, basically. Particularly when you lose a lot of the coastal and offshore routes that are there, because that brings up the prominence of everything else, because it's all a relative weighting, if that makes sense.
Did I hear correctly that you fed back into the model where the archaeological sites were to figure out what were the more?
No. So the really cool thing is the model it's a computer. It doesn't know about archaeology. It doesn't know about archaeological sites. So you run the model and the computer says, well, these are the paths. And you go, well, you're a computer. I don't know whether they're the paths or not. How can we test that? And how you test it then is to see how closely those paths align with the known archaeology. And that is there's in fact, I think, been some quite new statistical stuff done on how you actually do that. How do you relate a path to a series of points, which was done for this project by them, but I'm not qualified to talk about it. But literally, the model doesn't know about the archaeology. We use the archaeology to validate the model, or to say which bits of or which options from all the models we could run appear to produce a significant relationship to the archaeology, which is like 6 of them out of 18 or something that were run.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate you stepping in today, and we have a gift for you.
Thank you.
And so if everyone could tell, thank you.